They called it a small piece of evidence, just an old, faded shirt. But to one German shepherd, it smelled like the truth. His name was Shadow, and he wasn't just a K9. He was the kind of partner who listened, beyond orders, who saw pain, where others saw procedure. That day in court, a little girl's voice broke under the weight of her memories, and while the adults argued over facts and files, Shadow walked straight toward the one clue everyone had missed. What he uncovered wasn't just a shirt. It was proof of love, of courage, of the connection between two souls who refused to give up on each other. By the end of this story, you'll understand why so many say, dogs are angels we're lucky enough to live beside. Because Shadow didn't just solve a case, he healed a heart. And that is something no badge can teach. The courthouse felt too large for a child. Its ceilings rose like the inside of a cathedral, where whispers turned to echoes, and every shuffle of a shoe seemed to matter. Afternoon light bled through the narrow windows, painting long, tired stripes across the benches and the oak-paneled walls. Dust hung motionless in the still air, each speck caught between light and shadow, just like the truth that hovered unspoken in the room. Officer Mark Reynolds sat near the witness stand, his uniform pressed but his face worn with quiet empathy. Beside him lay Shadow, his German shepherd partner. Muscular, alert, yet calm, his dark coat gleaming faintly under the sunbeam slicing through the blinds. The courtroom murmurs swirled around them, low and uneasy, like the sound of a storm still miles away but drawing near. The door creaked open. 2 bailiffs entered first, then Emily Carter, 10 years old, fragile as the paper she clutched in her small hands. Her eyes darted across the room. Too many faces, too many adults staring. She moved as if every step demanded permission. Her hair, brushed neatly that morning, had already begun to curl into anxious wisps around her face. She wore a pale yellow dress that looked borrowed, its sleeves too long, hiding her wrists. Mark rose slowly. "Hey," he whispered as she neared, lowering himself to her eye level. "You're not alone, kiddo." His voice was steady, not forced, like the sound of a man who had said the same thing to too many broken souls, but still meant it every time. Emily didn't reply, but she glanced at Shadow, who sat perfectly still, his ears tilted slightly forward. Something in his eyes, something warm and wordless, seemed to anchor her trembling. She hesitated, then reached out. Her tiny fingers brushed his fur. Shadow didn't move, except for a gentle press of his head against her leg. It was subtle, but Mark saw it. That quiet act of comfort only a creature without judgment could give. The judge entered. The room rose. "Court is now in session," came the bailiff's announcement, the gavel striking once. The sound hit Emily like thunder. Her shoulders jumped. Mark stayed close, his hand resting loosely at his side, letting her know he was there, not to lead, but to stand beside. Prosecutor Diane Holt adjusted her glasses, rising with her folder in hand. Her tone was measured but soft when she addressed the court. "Your Honor, we're calling Emily Carter to the stand." Every eye followed the little girl as she made her way up. Her small shoes scuffed against the polished floor. Shadow's gaze followed her, steady and unblinking. The judge, an older man with a voice as heavy as the wooden bench he sat upon, leaned slightly forward. "Miss Carter, can you promise to tell the truth today?" Emily nodded faintly. Her voice didn't come. The clerk gently prompted, "You need to say it out loud, sweetheart." She swallowed. Her lips moved. I promise." A few jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Defense attorney Mitchell Graves, sharp in his tailored gray suit, leaned back, tapping a pen against his notepad, a hint of skepticism curling his lips. To him, she was just another uncertain witness, another fragile piece of a case already bending under pressure. Diane approached, her footsteps quiet but deliberate. "Emily," she began, "can you tell us what happened that night?" The question hung in the air like a weight. Emily's fingers twisted in her lap. The paper she'd been holding, her drawing of Shadow, was crumpled now, the pencil lines smudged by sweat. Her lips trembled. He was angry again," she whispered. "Objection," the defense attorney said, leading the witness. "Sustained," the judge replied. Diane took a breath. "Emily, take your time. You're safe here." Safe. The word echoed in her mind. Safe had never meant much. Not when footsteps in the hallway made her flinch. Not when silence meant danger. Not when she'd learned to hide in closets and count seconds between shouts. Her eyes darted toward Mark. He didn't say anything, just gave a small nod. Shadow's tail brushed the floor once, soft as breath. Emily opened her mouth again, but her voice cracked. The memory, raw and jagged, caught in her throat. Her gaze blurred. All she could see were shoes, floor tiles, the shadow of the man who had hurt her. Her small body trembled. The word dissolved. The courtroom went utterly still. Even the air seemed to pause. Her shoulders shook as she hid her face behind her hands. Diane stepped forward but stopped, knowing the wrong kind of comfort could break the fragile balance. Mark rose instinctively, his badge glinting in the slanted light. He didn't approach the stand. Protocol wouldn't allow it. But his voice reached across the space like a hand extended in the dark. "Emily," he said gently, "you're doing great. Just breathe, okay? You don't have to rush." She looked at him, tears shimmering but unshed, and then something shifted. Shadow stood. His movements were slow, deliberate. He padded forward a few steps, stopping right at the boundary line before the bench, just close enough for her to see him clearly. The bailiff moved to intercept, but the judge lifted a hand. "It's all right." Shadow sat there, eyes lifted toward the trembling girl. No sound, no growl, no bark, just presence. Emily's sobs softened. For a moment, the courtroom wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a small room filled with light, a man in uniform, and a dog who refused to look away. Then silence, the kind that makes you forget to breathe. Mark's throat tightened. He'd seen soldiers crumble under gunfire with steadier hands than this child had now. Yet here she was, fighting ghosts no one else could see. "Do you want to stop for a while?" the judge asked softly. Emily nodded. The gavel struck once. Court will recess for 10 minutes. Chairs scraped, papers shuffled, voices returned in low murmurs. But Mark stayed where he was, eyes still on Emily, who sat frozen on the stand. Shadow didn't move either. He simply lay down, chin resting on his paws, eyes never leaving the girl. When she finally climbed down, she walked straight to him. Not to Mark, not to anyone else. She knelt, burying her face in the fur at his neck. No one spoke, not even Graves. Mark knelt beside them, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You did good, kiddo," he whispered. "You were brave." Emily didn't answer, but her breathing slowed. In that quiet corner of the courtroom, beneath the fading gold of the afternoon light, Something unspoken passed between them. A promise neither needed to say out loud. Shadow's ears twitched once, then stilled. His gaze drifted toward the old evidence box left forgotten near the bench. The faint scent that lingered there tugged at his instinct. But that moment, his quiet recognition, would wait until the next scene. For now, the only truth that mattered was this. A frightened child had found safety not in words, but in the steady heartbeat of a loyal friend. And sometimes, in the face of all the noise and judgment and cruelty of the world, that was the beginning of justice. The courtroom emptied slowly, like a wave receding after a storm. The sharp crack of the gavel had silenced the moment, but the echo still lingered in the walls. Papers shuffled, voices dropped to murmurs, and the air began to breathe again. Yet even as people moved, the tension hung thick, invisible, but heavy enough to feel. Mark stayed near the front, leaning against the wooden divider, watching as Emily crouched between the benches at the far end of the room. She had tucked herself into a small corner, hidden from most eyes. Her little hands clutched the hem of her dress, knuckles white, shoulders trembling with leftover fear. He didn't call out to her. Sometimes, words only made things harder. Instead, he let Shadow do what he did best: read hearts without needing sound. The German Shepherd stood motionless for a moment, nose twitching, ears rotating slightly. His dark eyes followed the faint tremor in the air, that electric stillness animals sense when something isn't quite right. He sniffed once toward Emily, a soft, reassuring exhale, then turned his head slowly toward the cluster of evidence boxes stacked against the wall near the prosecution table. They had been there all day, untouched and unnoticed. Cardboard marked with fading ink. Case 4117A. Carter, Emily. Domestic abuse. Some boxes were half open, revealing envelopes and photographs. Others were sealed tight with layers of tape, as if someone had wanted to lock the past away. Shadow moved closer. Mark frowned. "What is it, boy?" The shepherd's body lowered slightly, not a sign of fear, but of focus. His tail stiffened, his breathing changed rhythm, and his nostrils flared, with purpose. Mark recognized that body language instantly. It wasn't restlessness. It was recognition. That look, the one he had seen on missions when Shadow had caught the faint scent of explosives buried meters underground, or a missing child's trail washed out by rain. The kind of certainty no human training could teach. "Easy, partner," Mark murmured. "Take your time." Shadow circled once around the nearest box, then sat beside it, eyes fixed on the cardboard like it was alive. His ears twitched once, then stilled. Across the room, Prosecutor Diane Holt noticed the movement and paused in her conversation with an assistant. "Officer Reynolds, everything okay?" "Yeah," Mark replied, though his gaze never left Shadow. "He's just curious." The truth was, Mark trusted that dog's curiosity more than most people's conclusions. He crouched beside him, placing a steady hand on his back. "You smell something." Shadow's nose pressed to a corner seam, inhaling deeply. Then came a short, deliberate huff. Not excitement, not alert. Something softer, familiar, personal. Mark peeled back the tape and lifted the lid. Inside were items from Emily's home. A few kitchen utensils, photographs, and a small box of worn clothes sealed in a clear plastic bag. Shadow leaned in and nudged that bag gently with his snout. His eyes met Mark's. An unspoken message passed in silence. "You sure?" Mark asked quietly. Shadow's tail tapped once against the floor. Diane approached. That box wasn't part of the active evidence anymore, she said, puzzled. Judge dismissed it before the hearing. We didn't think anything in there was relevant. Mark didn't answer immediately. He was watching Shadow. The dog pressed his paw lightly against the phone. Plastic. Right over what looked like a tiny sleeve. A child's shirt, pale blue, faded, with one corner stained darker than the rest. Emily peeked from behind the benches, drawn by the motion. Her eyes followed the dog, curious despite her fear. "That's mine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark turned. "What did you say, sweetheart?" "That shirt," she said again, pointing with hesitant fingers. It used to be mine." Diane blinked. "Are you sure?" Emily nodded, stepping out slowly, her small shoes barely making a sound on the polished floor. He didn't like when I wore it," she said softly. "Said it was ugly, so I hid it." Her voice faltered. "I didn't think anyone would find it again." Mark's pulse quickened, though his face remained composed. "Shadow, stay." The shepherd obeyed instantly, eyes never leaving the shirt. Mark turned to Diane. "You might want to get that tested again." Diane hesitated. The lab already cleared it. It was listed as irrelevant material. "Maybe," Mark said, his tone gentle but firm. "But Shadow doesn't waste his time." Diane studied him for a long moment, the kind of look prosecutors give when instinct clashes with procedure. Finally, she sighed. "All right. I'll call the forensics team tonight." Emily stepped closer to Shadow. The dog lowered his head slightly, inviting her approach. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed his fur again. "He found it," she whispered. "He always finds things." Mark smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's his job." The courthouse was nearly empty now, but a strange stillness filled the space again. Not fear this time, something else. Anticipation. Like the air itself knew that whatever Shadow had uncovered wasn't done speaking. The overhead lights flickered once before humming back to life. The janitor's mop squeaked somewhere down the hallway, distant and irrelevant. But Mark's eyes stayed on that small blue shirt. He didn't need the forensics report to tell him it mattered. He had spent years learning to read what others missed. The tremor in a voice. The pause between breaths. The quiet ways truth tries to be found. He looked at Emily, then back at Shadow. "You're onto something, aren't you, boy?" Shadow's ears perked, and a low rumble, not aggression, but focus, vibrated in his chest. Mark felt a strange chill trace his spine. It wasn't fear. It was the instinctive awareness that something buried deep had just stirred. Diane began gathering her files, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "We'll reopen the analysis," she said. "But let's not jump ahead. Could just be coincidence." "Sure," Mark said, though he didn't believe in coincidence. Not when Shadow was involved. Emily's small hand rested gently on the dog's head. She was calmer now, her breathing slower. "He's smart," she said, her voice steadier than before. "He knows things." Mark crouched beside them both. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Sometimes he knows before we do." The three of them stayed like that for a moment. The weary officer, the scarred child, and the dog whose nose had just shifted the weight of an entire case. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, slipping from gold to gray. The courthouse walls caught the last glimmers, stretching long shadows across the floor. Shadow's figure merged with them perfectly, his silhouette sharp and silent, a guardian woven into the very edges of twilight. Mark exhaled, slow and measured. Something had changed in that room. The atmosphere felt different, charged with the quiet energy of discovery. He didn't know yet what the shirt would reveal, or how deep the trail would lead. But he trusted the feeling growing in his chest, that quiet certainty only cops and dogs share when something true has been unearthed. Shadow nudged the box once more, then looked up, eyes gleaming. "Yeah," Mark said under his breath, a small, grim smile forming. "I hear you, partner. We'll follow it." And as the last echo of footsteps faded down the marble corridor, a whisper of instinct lingered, soft, persistent, and unmistakably alive. Something hidden beneath the surface had just begun to speak. The precinct was quieter at night. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in a pale, sterile glow. Rows of filing cabinets and evidence lockers lined the narrow room, their labels faded from years of cases long forgotten. The smell was a mix of dust, metal, and faint disinfectant, the scent of justice, worn thin. Officer Mark Reynolds stood in the middle of it all, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the weight of fatigue settling deep in his shoulders. Shadow sat beside him, perfectly still, eyes fixed on the corner of the room where a stack of unexamined evidence bags had been left to wait, or to be forgotten. Across the table, Detective Sarah Lane was half buried in paperwork. Her hair was tied up in a loose bun, glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She was sharp, methodical, and endlessly pragmatic, the kind of detective who believed in evidence over instinct, procedure over hunches. Mark broke the silence first. "It's that bag," he said, nodding toward the pile. Sarah didn't look up. "The Carter case?" "Mark, that's already been reviewed. Everything relevant's been logged." "Not everything," he replied. "Shadow's been restless since we got back." Sarah sighed, setting down her pen. "Restless? He's a dog, Mark. Maybe he's tired of sitting around paperwork." Mark's jaw tightened slightly. He crouched beside Shadow, running a hand over his thick coat. "You smell something, buddy?" Shadow's ears perked, nose twitching toward one particular bag, a clear plastic one, sealed and labeled Evidence 417A, Domestic Neglect. Sarah noticed. "That one's from the house. Mostly junk, kitchen rags, old clothes, nothing usable." Shadow didn't seem to agree. He moved closer, pawing once at the bottom of the bag, then sitting down, gaze unwavering. Mark smiled faintly. "That look again." Sarah rolled her eyes. "What look?" "The one that's cost me a dozen sleepless nights and solved twice as many cases." He tore open the seal carefully, spreading the contents across the metal table. There were scraps of fabric, a broken hairbrush, a half-melted crayon, and at the bottom, the small, faded shirt Shadow had fixated on. It was light blue once, but now dulled to gray. The edges were frayed, one sleeve torn. Faint stains marked the collar and hem, some dark, some faintly yellowed. Mark held it up by the shoulders, brows furrowing. Sarah glanced over, unimpressed. "Old laundry. It's not evidence, the lab already cleared it." Mark ignored her tone. "You smell it?" he asked quietly, more to himself than her. He brought the fabric closer to his face. There was something there. Something faint but sharp. Smoke. Not fresh, but old and stubborn, clinging to the threads like memory. Shadow stepped forward, nose brushing the shirt. He inhaled deeply, then whined. Soft, low, almost mournful. Sarah frowned. "What's he doing?" Mark didn't answer right away. His hand froze mid-air. He looked at Shadow, really looked. The dog's ears so tilted back slightly, eyes soft and heavy. He wasn't alerting for danger. He was reacting to something else entirely. Grief. Mark set the shirt down on the table, heart thudding quietly. He's not responding to the smell, he murmured. He's responding to what it means. Sarah's brow furrowed. You're saying your dog understands emotional context now? Mark shot her a look. Not angry, but pained. You've never worked with a trauma case like this, have you? He turned back to the evidence, unfolding the shirt completely. The fabric was stiff and shot. Some places, hardened residue, maybe food. On the lower edge near the hem, a small burn mark spread outward in a perfect circle, blackened and rough. Sarah noticed it too. Cigarette? Maybe, Mark said quietly. Or maybe worse. He reached for a magnifier, holding it up to the fibers. The burn hadn't been accidental. It had sunk deep enough to melt through 2 layers. He didn't need forensics to tell him what that meant. The memory of Emily's small voice echoed in his mind. He used to burn things when he got mad. Mark exhaled, long and slow. Shadow found this for a reason. Sarah crossed her arms, watching him carefully. Her skepticism softened just a little. You think this proves physical abuse? I think, he said, voice low, it proves she lived in hell. Silence filled the room again. The hum of the lights grew louder somehow. Mark sat down at the edge of the table, the shirt lying between them. Shadow rested beside it, head on his paws, a soft whine escaping his throat. It wasn't impatience. It was empathy, the kind animals feel when they recognize suffering older than words. For a long moment, Mark didn't move. His eyes stayed on the shirt, but his mind drifted somewhere else, back to the night they first found Emily. Dim light flickered through cracked blinds. The smell of smoke filled the small apartment, the kind that clings to everything it touches: curtains, hair, childhood. A television blared somewhere, half static, half shouting. Little Emily sat curled on the floor, arms around her knees, the faded blue shirt clutched to her chest. Her stepfather's voice thundered from the kitchen, words slurred, angry, like the growl of a wounded beast. She held her breath as footsteps drew closer. The door slammed. She could hear the hiss of a cigarette being lit, the sound she had learned to fear more than shouting. Then, the sharp smell of smoke. She pressed her face into the shirt, praying it would hide her, that the soft cotton could make her invisible. A muffled cry, a crash, and silence. Back in the present, Mark blinked hard, the image fading. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. Sarah watched him. You okay? He nodded once, then reached down to rest his hand on Shadow's back. Yeah, he murmured, just remembering why we do this. Sarah hesitated before speaking. You really think this shirt can change the case? Mark looked at her, his voice steady but filled with conviction. I don't think, I know. Shadow's never wrong. The dog lifted his head slightly at the sound of his name, ears twitching as if to agree. Sarah stepped closer, studying the burn mark again. The disbelief in her expression faded into something else. Quiet unease. You should get it retested, she said finally. I will, Mark replied. He folded the shirt carefully, his movements deliberate, almost reverent. But this isn't just evidence anymore. This is her story. In fabric, in scars, in every mark that got ignored. Shadow shifted closer, lying down beside the folded shirt. chin resting next to it. His tail stilled completely, breathing slow and steady. Mark felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, not even sorrow. Something deeper. The kind of ache that comes when you realize the job you're doing isn't about procedure or conviction records anymore. It's about people who can't protect themselves. He whispered, almost to himself, "This isn't just a case." Sarah looked up. "What is it then?" Mark's gaze fell to Shadow, whose eyes were still fixed on the shirt. Calm, faithful, resolute. "It's a rescue," he said softly. The words hung in the cold air, simple but absolute, and as Shadow let out one quiet breath, a sigh that sounded almost human, the hum of the fluorescent lights dimmed into the background, leaving behind the sound of quiet conviction. A man, a dog, and a promise reborn from a faded blue shirt. The therapy room was small, tucked into the back corner of the precinct's outreach wing. Unlike the cold metal and fluorescent glare of the evidence room, this space felt warmer. Soft lamplight spilling over pale blue walls, the faint hum of an air vent, and a box of crayons resting untouched on the low table. Emily Carter sat in the corner of the couch, her knees drawn up, a blanket draped around her shoulders like armor. Her shoes dangled just above the floor. She wasn't crying. Not anymore. Her eyes were still and distant, the way someone looks after they've learned to live inside silence. Across from her sat Officer Mark Reynolds, sleeves rolled, tie loosened. He didn't take notes, didn't speak right away. His notepad lay closed beside him. He knew too many cops made the mistake of talking too soon, of filling the space meant for pain to breathe. On the floor between them, Shadow lay curled like a dark crescent of calm, his tail tapping gently once every few seconds. His ears flicked toward Emily every time she shifted, always present, always patient. A therapist had been there earlier, but had stepped out at Mark's request. Emily trusted him more, not because of his badge, but because of the quiet way he carried himself, the way Shadow never looked away. Mark's voice was low when he finally spoke. "You don't have to tell me everything today. Just what you can." Emily's fingers fidgeted with the edge of the blanket. "You found my shirt," she said softly. He nodded. Shadow did. He's good at finding what matters. Her gaze flickered toward the dog, who lifted his head slightly, his amber eyes glowing in the lamplight. A hint of a smile ghosted across her face, gone almost before it formed. For a long time, she said nothing. The clock ticked on the stone wall, the slow rhythm of time giving her permission to gather courage. Then, haltingly, the words came. "That night," her voice quivered, "he was drinking again. I remember the smell. It made my eyes hurt." Mark leaned forward, elbows on his knees, saying nothing. "I hid in the closet," she continued. "The one in my room. It was dark, but I could still see light under the door. I thought if I stayed quiet, he wouldn't find me." Her hands gripped the blanket tighter. Her breathing quickened, uneven. "He was yelling about something. I don't know what. Mom tried to stop him, but..." Her voice cracked. "He started breaking things. The lamp, the chair. Then I heard the lighter click." Mark's fingers tightened against his knees. He knew that sound, that distinct metallic snap, followed by a rush of flame. "He burned my drawing first," she whispered. "Said it was ugly, said I was wasting paper. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move." Shadow's head lifted. He shifted closer, his body pressing gently against her legs. Emily looked down, startled, then slowly placed her hand on his back. Her small fingers sank into his fur, gripping like she was holding on to something real for the first time. Her voice trembled. Then he dropped the cigarette. It landed on my shirt. The blue one. Mark's breath caught. Emily's eyes filled, but she kept talking. Not crying, just letting the truth fall out in broken pieces. I tried to put it out. It smelled so bad. Like burnt food and smoke and something worse. He just laughed. She looked up at Mark suddenly, like she was afraid she'd said too much. Am I in trouble? Mark shook his head quickly. No, Emily, you're not in trouble. None of this is your fault. Her lower lip trembled. But Mom said not to talk about it, that it would just make him angrier. Mark's chest ached. He took a deep breath, steadying his tone. Your mom was scared too. Sometimes grown-ups don't know how to protect themselves, even when they want to. Emily nodded slowly, her gaze falling back to Shadow. But he found it. The shirt. Yeah, Mark said softly. He did. She reached for the evidence bag that lay on the table, the faded blue fabric inside. Her fingers hesitated before touching the plastic, then rested on it lightly. For a few seconds, she didn't breathe. Then, barely above a whisper, he used to burn things when he got mad. The words hung in the room like smoke, invisible but choking. Mark felt the air leave his lungs. Across the small one-way mirror behind the wall, Detective Sarah Lane was watching. Her pen froze mid-note. The implications sank in like ice. What had once seemed like negligence was now abuse. Deliberate, violent, traceable. Emily's hand slipped from the bag. She leaned back into the couch, exhausted by the weight of her own memories. Shadow shifted again, moving until his head rested gently across her feet. The warmth of his body seeped through the blanket, grounding her. She exhaled shakily, the first real breath of release she'd taken since the hearing. Mark rose slowly, stepping toward the window where Sarah stood behind the mirrored glass. Their eyes met, his steady, hers wide with realization. No words were needed. They both understood what had just happened. The case had changed forever. Sarah's lips parted. We can reopen, she mouthed through the glass. Mark gave a single nod. His hand brushed the edge of the table where Emily's crayon box sat untouched. He picked up one crayon, blue, the same shade as that small shirt. Then he set it down again, as if returning something sacred to its place. Turning back to Emily, he crouched beside her. You did something very brave today. She shook her head. I just talked. That's brave, he said gently. Telling the truth always is. Her eyes flicked toward him, uncertain. Will he go away now? Mark hesitated. Truth was tricky with children, but he said what mattered most. We'll make sure he can't hurt you again. Emily nodded, her shoulders relaxing just a little. Mark glanced down at Shadow, whose steady gaze met his. In that look, Mark saw everything the dog couldn't say aloud. Faith, loyalty, and something deeper, a knowing. He whispered under his breath, Good work, partner. Shadow's tail tapped once against the floor. Outside the window, dusk had fallen. The lamplight reflected faintly off the mirrored wall, catching the faint glisten of tears at the corner of Emily's eyes. But this time they weren't born of fear. They were release, the kind that comes when someone finally believes you. Mark stood, chest tight but steady. Get some rest, kiddo, he said softly. Tomorrow we'll talk more. Emily nodded, leaning forward to press her cheek against Shadow's head. Good night, Shadow, she whispered. The dog didn't move, Just let her hold him, still as stone, warm as life itself. Mark turned to leave, pausing at the door to look back once more. The little girl, the dog, the faded shirt, each bound together by threads invisible to law or evidence, but stronger than both. And as he stepped into the hallway where Sarah waited, the weight of what they'd just heard settled like thunder in his chest. He didn't say it out loud, but they both knew. Time, 100 pounds. The truth had finally found its voice, and it had spoken through a child and her loyal friend. The hum of the forensics lab filled the air, low, constant, mechanical. Machines whirred softly, punctuated by the faint click of test tubes and the occasional buzz of an analyzer resetting its sequence. The sterile light above gleamed off glass surfaces, reflecting in sharp, cold flashes. It was a place of numbers and evidence, not emotion. But tonight, emotion hung heavier than science. Detective Sarah Lane stood by the double-glass observation window, arms folded tight across her chest. On the stainless steel table behind the partition lay the small blue shirt, sealed in a new evidence bag. It looked harmless, worn, faded, too small to belong in a crime lab. Yet everyone in the room understood. This piece of fabric carried the weight of a child's story, one that could finally make or break the case. Mark Reynolds leaned against the far wall, uniform jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Shadow sat beside him, quiet and alert, eyes fixed on the table as if he too was watching the truth emerge. The forensic technician, Dr. Mason Ortega, adjusted his glasses and typed something into the console. "We've run it 3 times now," he said without looking up. "Same readings every pass." Sarah frowned. "What are we looking at?" Mason glanced at her, then at Mark. "Chemical traces. Residues consistent with chronic exposure. Neglect, possibly worse. I'm seeing ammonia, nicotine, and trace methamphetamine vapors embedded in the fabric." The words landed like a punch. Mark's jaw clenched. "Meth?" "Yeah," Mason replied grimly. "Levels aren't high enough to suggest direct contact, but the particles are inside the fibers, meaning long-term environmental exposure. That little girl lived in it." Sarah swore under her breath. So the place was a lab. Mark's stomach turned. He could picture it now. The dark apartment, yellowed walls, burnt furniture, the stale air. A child hiding in closets while chemicals ate away at her lungs. The shirt wasn't just proof of neglect. It was proof of contamination, danger, life-threatening harm. Mason continued, voice flattening into the cadence of a man poisoned to describe the unthinkable. "The burn marks? Confirmed cigarette contact. Repeated exposure, judging by the layering of soot. The girl's statement matches perfectly. He burned things when he got angry." Sarah rubbed her temples. "Jesus." Mark said nothing. He just looked at Shadow, who sat motionless at his feet. The dog's amber eyes reflected the lab's white light, unblinking, calm. "Mark," Sarah said quietly, "you realize what this means, right? The case isn't about emotional abuse anymore. It's chemical endangerment. We're talking felony charges, child cruelty, possession, intent, maybe worse." He nodded, voice low. "Shadow found the proof we couldn't see." Mason exhaled. "I'll have the report on your desk in an hour. It's solid. The court won't be able to argue it." Sarah stepped out of the lab to make the call to the prosecutor's office. Mark stayed behind, watching as Mason resealed the evidence bag with gloved hands. Each click of the tape felt final, like sealing up a piece of history that had waited too long to be heard. When Mason left, the room went still again. The machines kept humming, but the sound felt distant, hollow. Mark crouched beside Shadow, running a hand through his fur. You did good, boy, he whispered. You found what everyone else missed. Shadow pressed his head lightly against Mark's knee. Not excitement, just quiet acknowledgement. The bond between them wasn't built on rewards or training anymore. It was built on something older. Trust. Born from shared silence and endless hours in the young, dark. Minutes later, Diane Holt, the prosecutor, arrived. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, but her expression softened as soon as she saw the shirt laid out under the lab light. She'd seen hundreds of pieces of evidence in her career, but none that looked this small, this human. Sarah handed her the printout. Toxic exposure confirmed. Matches environmental traces found at the Carter residence. Diane scanned the pages, eyes darting across the data. ppm values, compound breakdowns, test signatures. Then her gaze stopped halfway down the sheet. She set it aside slowly, blinking back tears she hadn't expected. That dog, she whispered, voice breaking slightly. He just solved the case. Mark looked down, a faint, tired smile tugging at his mouth. He doesn't care about the credit. I do, Diane said, looking between the man and his dog. Because if not for him, that shirt would still be sitting in a corner labeled irrelevant. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the machines seemed to soften their hum. Then Diane cleared her throat, voice steadier now. We're filing a motion to reopen the evidence docket. I'll petition to include Shadow's contribution officially in the chain of custody. I want it on record that a K-9 unit discovered this lead. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You're giving a dog legal credit? Yes, Diane said firmly, because the truth deserves it, no matter where it comes from. Mark felt something tighten in his chest. Not pride exactly, but relief. For weeks he'd been fighting ghosts, doubt from colleagues, silence from Emily, indifference from the system. Now, finally, there was something solid. Science had caught up with instinct. He looked down at Shadow again. You hear that, partner? You're part of the team now. The dog tilted his head slightly, as if amused, and let out a small, low chuff of air. Not a bark, not quite a sigh. Diane smiled faintly through her tears. I wish I could put that in the report. Mark chuckled softly, rubbing Shadow's ear. You'd need a whole new form. Sarah returned from the hallway, hanging up her phone. The DA's in. He wants a full review first thing in the morning. They're calling this the Carter shirt evidence. The Carter shirt, Diane repeated, almost reverently. Not bad for a 10-year-old's faded piece of cloth. Mark's gaze lingered on it, still sealed beneath the lab light. He imagined Emily's small hands clutching it, the faint smell of smoke, the terror she must have lived through. But alongside the pain, another feeling bloomed quietly. Hope. Maybe for the first time the system would listen. He took a step back, watching the forensics tag the shirt for transfer. The label gleamed under the light. Exhibit A417, Carter, Emily. Diane turned to him. Mark, get some rest. Tomorrow we change the story. He nodded, but didn't move. His eyes stayed on Shadow. We already did, he murmured. As the others left, Mark remained alone in the lab. He reached out one last time, brushing his fingers against the sealed bag. The fabric was cold through the plastic, but he could still feel the weight of it. Not heavy, just real. Shadow shifted beside him, tail tapping once, twice like a heartbeat syncing with his own. Mark whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Sometimes faith starts with fur and ends with fingerprints. Outside, rain began to fall. Steady, cleansing, rhythmic. The lab's windows caught the reflection of streetlights through the water, painting the room in streaks of silver and blue. For the first time in months, Mark felt it. Not triumph, but something gentler. Justice, quietly beginning to feel possible again. The courthouse was full again. Every bench taken, every whisper hanging like static in the air. Reporters lined the back wall, their pens ready, their cameras poised. The Carter case had gone from a quiet proceeding to a public storm, and everyone wanted to see whether a police officer and his dog could really be trusted more than a man's word. The judge adjusted his glasses, his tone curt as he looked over the courtroom. We will now resume proceedings in the case of the State versus Carter. Defense, you may continue. Mitchell Graves, the defense attorney, rose slowly from his seat. Sharp suit, sharper smile. His voice was smooth as glass, the kind that cut without warning. Your Honor, he began, before we allow emotion to cloud the law, I must challenge the credibility of the evidence recently submitted and the methods used to obtain it. He turned toward the jury, voice rising just enough to carry. What we have here is a police department desperate for a headline. So desperate, they've allowed a dog to dictate the direction of a criminal trial. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. At the prosecution's table, Diane Holt bristled, but stayed composed. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is misrepresenting the investigative process. Sustained, the judge said. Stay focused, Mr. Graves. Graves nodded, feigning humility. Of course, Your Honor. I simply wish to examine the reliability of this so-called key evidence. A faded child's shirt, discovered not by trained forensics, but by a canine whose handler conveniently happened to be the officer closest to the witness. He smiled thinly. Suspicious timing, wouldn't you say? Diane stood. The forensics results have been verified by 3 independent labs. I'm not questioning the lab, Graves interrupted, turning like a predator circling its prey. I'm questioning how that evidence came to light in the first place. He faced the judge. The defense calls Officer Mark Reynolds to the stand. Mark rose slowly, his expression unreadable. Shadow stood with him, as if instinctively sensing the storm ahead. Together they walked to the witness stand, man and dog, steady amid the murmurs. The bailiff swore him in. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Shadow lay down beside the stand, head resting on his paws, calm as ever. The courtroom lights reflected in his eyes, amber and unshaken. Graves approached, hands clasped behind his back. Officer Reynolds, you've been a member of the K-9 division for, 15 years? 17, Mark corrected quietly. 17. Impressive. Tell me, in those 17 years, how many times has your partner here led you to evidence later deemed inadmissible? None, Mark replied. None. Graves raised an eyebrow. Not once? You expect this court to believe that in nearly 2 decades, your animal has been perfect? I didn't say perfect, Mark replied evenly. I said he's never been wrong. A few jurors smiled faintly. Graves didn't. Never been wrong, he repeated. That's a bold statement for an officer defending a dog who can't testify. Objection, Diane said. Argumentative. Sustained. Graves pressed on. Officer Reynolds, did you direct your K-9 to that specific evidence box, or did he act on his own? He acted on instinct, Mark said. Instinct, Graves echoed, pacing slowly. And you, as his handler, interpreted that instinct as proof of criminal neglect. Is that correct? Mark's gaze didn't waver. I interpreted it as something worth looking into. And I was right. Graves's smile thinned. Or perhaps you wanted to be right. He turned toward the jury again, voice sharpening. Ladies and gentlemen, consider this. A single police officer, emotionally invested in a frightened child, finds a scrap of clothing and decides it's evidence. He doesn't wait for procedure, doesn't check for contamination, doesn't even— Enough! Diane snapped, rising to her feet. This is character assassination. The judge's gavel cracked once. Order! But the tension had already spread, electric and volatile. Voices whispered. The jury shifted uneasily. Graves turned back to Mark, lowering his tone to a near whisper. Tell me, officer, did you ever stop to think that maybe you saw what you wanted to see? That maybe this little girl's story got tangled in your need to be the hero? The words struck like a slap. For a moment, Mark said nothing. The air thickened. Even Diane's hand, mid-motion, froze. Then Mark leaned forward slightly, voice low. Too quiet for anger, too steady for fear. You ever seen a child hide from a sound? Flinch at light? Forget how to breathe when someone raises their voice? Graves blinked. Mark continued, voice gaining weight with every word. I have. I've seen it in war zones, in shelters, in back alleys, and in her eyes. That shirt wasn't evidence because I wanted it to be. It was evidence because it was. The room fell silent. Graves tried to recover. You're emotional, officer. I'm human, Mark said simply, and so is she. He looked toward Emily, who sat in the gallery beside a court-appointed counselor. She met his gaze timidly, fingers twisting together in her lap. Then Shadow, sensing her presence, lifted his head. His eyes found hers. Steady, golden, kind. For a heartbeat, the entire courtroom stopped breathing. The hum of the lights, the creak of the benches, even Graves's polished voice, all fell away. It was just the two of them, a child and a dog, connected by something purer than law or logic. Emily smiled faintly through her fear, the first real smile anyone had seen from her. Shadow's tail brushed the floor once, quiet as a heartbeat. The judge cleared his throat softly, breaking the spell. Proceed, Mr. Graves. But Graves hesitated. His practiced rhythm was gone. He shuffled his notes, stammered, then said, No further questions. Diane rose, tone gentle but firm. Redirect, Your Honor. Proceed. She approached Mark, offering a small, reassuring nod. Officer Reynolds, just one question. Why did you trust your partner that day? Mark looked down at Shadow, then back up. Because he's never lied to me. The courtroom stayed silent. No one dared move. Diane turned to the judge. No further questions. The judge nodded. Officer, you may step down. Mark stood. Shadow followed. Together they returned to the prosecution table. Diane's hand brushed his arm as he passed. Not professional courtesy, but gratitude. As they sat, the air in the room slowly came back to life. The jury whispered softly. The reporters scribbled furiously. But Mark didn't hear any of it. He reached down, resting a hand on Shadow's back. You did good, boy, he whispered. The shepherd's chest rose and fell steadily, unshaken by the chaos around him. His calm was its own kind of testimony, one that no cross-examination could break. And as the gavel struck again, echoing through the room, the truth lingered, not shouted, not argued, but felt. In that moment, Shadow's silence carried more weight than any human voice. A symbol of loyalty in a room full of doubt, integrity amid arrogance, and the unwavering faith that in the end, truth does not bark, it simply stands. The city was quiet. The kind of quiet that follows exhaustion, not peace. A thin drizzle traced the window pane, each drop streaking downward like time trying to wash itself away. In the dim apartment, Mark Reynolds sat alone at his kitchen table, a single lamp glowing amber beside a half-empty cup of coffee gone cold. The rain outside wasn't heavy, just steady, rhythmic enough to fill the silence between his thoughts. He hadn't slept in 2 nights. His body was tired, but his mind refused to shut down. Every detail of the case replayed on loop. The blue shirt sealed in plastic, Emily's trembling voice, the glint in Graves's eyes when he accused him of faking the evidence. The sound of the gavel from that last hearing still echoed in his chest, like a heartbeat that wouldn't sink. Across the room, Shadow sat by the window, head lifted slightly, as if listening to the rain. His silhouette, broad and still, was cut against the gray light. Every now and then his ears twitched when a car passed or thunder rolled far in the distance. But mostly, he just stayed there, watchful, waiting. Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The precinct lights, the cameras, the crowd, it all blurred together now. He'd spent his whole career chasing truth, but this case had become something else entirely. It wasn't about catching a criminal anymore. It was about protecting a child who'd already survived more than most adults ever would. He glanced at the photo frame on the counter. His late wife, Claire, smiling in front of the old cabin they used to visit up north. Her hair was wind-tangled, her eyes half-closed from laughter. That picture had sat there for 5 years, but tonight, it felt closer than ever. The sound of rain softened, and Mark spoke into the empty room. "You'd tell me I'm overthinking, again." He smiled faintly, tiredly. "You always did." He stood, walking to the window where Shadow waited. His reflection looked older than he remembered. Creased eyes, faint gray at his temples, wear carved deep into his face. The kind of wear that doesn't fade with rest. "You remember what she used to say, boy?" he murmured, hand resting on Shadow's head. "You can't save everyone, but you can always protect one." Shadow turned his gaze up, amber eyes locking onto his. There was understanding in them. Not human understanding, but something deeper, cleaner. No judgment. Just faith. Mark knelt down beside him. The floor was cool beneath his knees. "That's what we're doing now. Protecting one, no matter what it takes." Shadow's tail brushed the floor once, slow and deliberate. Mark exhaled shakily, pressing his forehead against the dog's. "She reminds me of Lily," he whispered. "You never met her. She didn't make it. Wrong place, wrong call. My call." His voice cracked, the words barely escaping. He hadn't said her name aloud in years. Lily Reynolds, his daughter. She would have been 16 this year. The ache of that thought pressed hard against his ribs. "I couldn't save her," he continued, hand tightening in Shadow's fur. "But I can save this one. I can keep her safe. That's what Claire would have wanted." The rain picked up again, tapping harder against the glass. Each drop was a metronome of memory. He remembered the night Lily was taken from him. A drunk driver on a wet road. A call that came too late. By the time he reached the hospital, Claire was sitting in the hallway, her face blank, her voice gone. That silence had haunted him ever since, the silence of too late. Now, 5 years later, a new kind of silence filled his apartment. But this one carried a pulse, the faint sound of Shadow's steady breathing beside him, a heartbeat of loyalty anchoring him to the present. Mark stood, crossing to his desk. The case file lay open. Photographs, transcripts, chemical reports. He thumbed through them one by one, each page heavy with the weight of injustice. Emily's picture was clipped to the top, her eyes unsure, her smile faint. He traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb. "She's the one," he said quietly. "The one we protect." Shadow moved closer, resting his chin on Mark's thigh, grounding him back into the moment. Mark chuckled weakly. "Guess that's our thing, huh? You find the truth. I try to hold it up before it breaks." He turned off the desk lamp and sat back down, watching the rain blur the city lights into streaks of gold and gray. Outside, thunder murmured, distant but approaching, the kind of storm that announces itself softly before it swallows the night. He thought about tomorrow's verdict, about Graves, and how the man would tear apart every piece of evidence just to save face. About Emily, sitting small and fragile in that courtroom again. "She'll have to testify one more time," Mark whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "I don't know if she can handle it." Shadow looked up again, eyes calm, unwavering. Mark sighed. "Yeah, you're right. She's tougher than we think." He stood, walked to the window, and unlatched it. The night air slipped in, cool, damp, smelling faintly of rain and earth. He took a long breath, feeling the ache in his chest loosen just enough to let hope through. The street below was nearly empty. A single lamppost flickered near the curb, casting a cone of pale light over the puddles. Somewhere down the block, a siren wailed and faded into the distance. Mark leaned against the frame, staring into the dark. "You ever wonder," he said softly, "why we keep doing it? Why we keep walking into the same kind of hurt?" Shadow gave a low rumble. Not a growl, not a bark, just a sound, deep and knowing. Mark smiled faintly. "Yeah, me neither." He closed the window and sat back on the floor beside him. The room was quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes not from peace but from resolve. Mark rested a hand over Shadow's heart, feeling the slow, steady rhythm beneath his palm. It was warm, real, alive. "You and me, buddy," he whispered. "We protect her, no matter what." Shadow's tail tapped once like a promise. Outside, lightning flashed, painting the room in white for a single breath before darkness returned. The rain came harder now, fierce and endless, drumming against the roof. Mark didn't move. He stayed there on the floor, shoulder to shoulder with his oldest friend, staring into the storm until the line between man and dog blurred, two souls anchored by the same vow. In that stillness, he could almost hear Claire's voice again, carried softly by the rain. "You can't save everyone, but you can always protect one." He closed his eyes. The words settled into him like prayer, like forgiveness, like purpose reborn. Tomorrow, the world would demand proof. But tonight, in the quiet hum of the storm, he didn't need proof. He already had faith. The world in Emily's dream was nothing like the one she came from. It was wide and open, a field bathed in gold beneath a soft morning sun. Wind rippled through tall grass, brushing against her fingertips as she ran. Her laughter echoed across the distance, light and unbroken, the kind of laughter that had been missing from her since before she could remember. Ahead of her, Shadow ran too, his black coat gleaming under the light, his stride smooth and powerful. Every time he looked back, his amber eyes glowed with something more than recognition, assurance. The kind that said, "You're safe now." Emily chased him through the meadow, her small shoes barely touching the ground. She could feel her heart beating, not from fear this time, but joy. freedom. For once, there was no shouting behind closed doors, no smell of smoke or broken glass, just the sound of her own voice carried on the wind and the rhythmic patter of paws in front of her. When she stumbled, Shadow slowed, circling back, nudging her hand with his nose. She giggled, falling into the grass. The blades tickled her arms as she reached out to touch the silver badge dangling from his collar, the one Officer Mark Reynolds had given her for luck. "See?" she whispered, holding it up to the sunlight. "I didn't lose it." Shadow barked once, sharp but cheerful, then sat beside her, tail sweeping the grass. Together they watched the clouds drift lazily above. A butterfly landed on his nose, and she laughed again. That rare, soft sound that felt like it could heal something deep inside her. Then, just as she leaned against him, the sky began to fade. The gold turned pale. The field dimmed. The sound of rain replaced the wind, and the dream began to melt away. Emily woke with a start. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Her small hands clutched the blanket tight, her heart still racing. The faint morning light pushed through the curtains, soft and gray, the kind of light that comes before sunrise. Then she remembered. The foster home. The quiet woman who smelled of lavender and coffee. The safe bed. Her fingers brushed something cold near her pillow. The small police K-9 badge Mark had given her before leaving the courthouse. She picked it up, tracing the worn edges with her thumb. It gleamed faintly in the dim light. "Keep it," he'd said, "for luck, and so you know we're never far." Emily held it against her chest. "He's coming today," she whispered to herself. "He promised." The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Thompson, her foster mother, peeked in. Her face was kind, tired in the way that comes from years of caring too deeply. "Morning, sweetheart," she said softly. "Did you sleep all right?" Emily nodded, though her eyes were still far away, somewhere between the dream and the memory of the dog running through it. Mrs. Thompson walked over, kneeling beside the bed. She brushed a lock of hair from Emily's forehead, her hand trembling slightly. The small badge caught her eye, and she smiled through the quiet ache behind her expression. "He'll be there tomorrow," she said, her voice warm but unsteady. Emily's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Shadow too?" Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Shadow too." A tear slipped down her cheek as she said it, not from sadness, but from something deeper, hope, mixed with admiration, for a child who had seen too much darkness and still dared to believe in light. "Come on now," she whispered. "Let's get you ready." The morning unfolded like a quiet symphony of small, steady preparations. Outside, the world was gray and wet, puddles dotting the driveway, mist clinging to the air. In one part of the city, Mark stood in front of his bathroom mirror, buttoning his uniform with methodical care. His reflection looked older, but steadier. The badge glinted over his heart, the same badge he'd promised Emily would mean something. Behind him, Shadow sat by the door, watching every movement. His ears perked each time Mark reached for a piece of gear. The belt, the radio, the polished shoes. "You ready, partner?" Mark asked, voice low, gravelly from a sleepless night. Shadow tilted his head, as if answering yes. Mark smiled faintly. "She's counting on us." He slipped on his jacket, fabric dark and crisp, smelling faintly of rain and leather. Then he reached down, clipping Shadow's lead to his collar. The metal clicked softly, a sound both ordinary and sacred. As they walked toward the door, Shadow paused by the small framed photo of Claire and Lily on the entry table. Mark followed his gaze and stopped, letting his fingers brush the edge of the frame. "I know," he murmured. "They'll be watching today." Across town, in the small foster home bedroom, Emily stood in front of a mirror of her own. It was old and slightly fogged, but she didn't mind. Her hands worked carefully through her hair, pulling it back into a small braid. She'd practiced this all week, wanting to look brave, just like Officer Mark told her she was. Mrs. Thompson stood in the doorway, holding a soft blue ribbon, almost the same shade as that faded shirt the forensics team had found. "You might like this," she said gently. Emily turned, eyes widening. "It's pretty." Mrs. Thompson tied it gently at the end of her braid. "There," she said softly. "Perfect." Emily smiled for real this time. "Do you think they'll let me sit near him?" she asked. Mrs. Thompson's throat tightened. "I think they'll want you right where he can see you." Emily looked down at the badge again, then slipped it into the pocket of her dress. "For luck," she whispered. The story unfolded in parallel. Two hearts, preparing for the same day, separated by miles, but bound by purpose. Mark adjusted his tie, shoulders squared, the weight of duty settling over him like armor. Emily smoothed her dress, clutching the badge as if it could steady her heartbeat. Shadow trotted beside Mark through the hallway, the rhythmic sound of claws on tile echoing like a drumbeat of faith. At the same time, Emily's shoes tapped softly against the wooden floor as she followed Mrs. Thompson to the kitchen for breakfast. Small steps filled with quiet courage. Two worlds. Two preparations. Mark paused at his front door, rain pooling on the steps outside. "Ready?" he asked again. Shadow gave a low, confident rumble. At that same moment, Emily stood by the window, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. She whispered, "I'm ready." The morning light deepened, painting both scenes in muted silver. Mark placed his cap on his head. Emily tied her shoelaces one last time, and as the church bells rang from somewhere across town, their worlds aligned. A man and his dog walking into the storm of justice, and a child gathering her courage to stand in it. Both hearts beat to the same rhythm. Both carried the same hope. And somewhere between them, the faint sound of paws running through golden grass lingered, the echo of a dream that still believed in freedom. The courthouse was heavy with silence, the kind that presses down on hearts and slows every breath. The morning rain had stopped hours ago, but its scent lingered, drifting through the open windows like a quiet promise of change. The wooden benches were full, every seat taken, every eye fixed on the small figure walking toward the witness stand. Emily Carter. Her steps were slow, deliberate, the small click of her shoes echoing through the courtroom. She wore a soft blue ribbon in her hair, the same shade as the shirt that had changed everything. Her foster mother sat near the back, hands clasped in silent prayer. At the prosecution table, Officer Mark Reynolds sat beside Prosecutor Diane Holt, his jaw tight, his eyes following Emily with the same quiet steadiness he'd shown since the first day. Shadow lay at his feet, alert but calm, his presence a living reminder that faith sometimes comes with 4 legs and steady eyes. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp but subdued. "Court is now in session." Emily climbed the small wooden steps to the stand. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the edge, but her posture was straighter than before, stronger. She took the oath in a voice barely above a whisper, but every word was clear. "You may begin," said the judge. Diane stood, her voice gentle but firm. "Emily, do you remember the last time you were here?" Emily nodded. I was scared." "And how do you feel today?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the front row, where Mark and Shadow sat. "Not scared anymore," she said softly. A faint murmur spread through the gallery, followed by silence. Diane gave her an encouraging smile. "That's very brave of you. Emily, we just need to talk about what happened that night one more time. You don't have to rush. Take your time." Emily's fingers twisted together. "He was mad," she began, voice small but steady. "He always got mad when there wasn't money, or when the house smelled like smoke. I hid in the closet. I had my blue shirt." Diane nodded gently. "The same shirt that was brought into evidence?" "Yes," Emily said, her voice trembling. "That one." She paused, eyes darting between the judge, the jurors, and then Posto to Shadow. The German shepherd hadn't moved. He sat perfectly still, ears tilted forward, gaze fixed on her as if reminding her she wasn't alone. Emily took a deep breath, her voice trembling but clear. "He used to burn things when he got mad. Sometimes he'd touch my clothes with a cigarette to scare me. But I never told anyone. I thought nobody would believe me." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Even the judge's pen stopped. Diane's voice softened. "Emily, how did you remember all this? You once said you didn't know how you found the strength." Emily looked down, then lifted her gaze to Shadow. "He found the shirt," she said quietly. "He remembered what I couldn't." The words hung in the air like music. No one moved. Even the defense attorney lowered his eyes. Diane swallowed hard. "And what do you want the court to know today?" "That it wasn't just the bad things," Emily said. "Someone helped me. Someone saw me. And that's what saved me." "Thank you, Emily," Diane said softly. "You've been very brave." The judge nodded. "Mr. Graves, cross-examination?" Graves hesitated. "No questions, Your Honor." "You may step down, Miss Carter." Emily slid off the stand. As she passed, Shadow shifted slightly, and she paused to press a hand to his fur. "Thank you," she whispered. Shadow licked her hand once. Eyes, warm and knowing. The judge turned to the jury. "You may now retire to deliberate." Time passed in tense silence. Then the jury returned. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Robert Carter, guilty on all counts." The words cracked the air. Emily gasped. Mrs. Thompson pulled her close. Diane exhaled shakily. Mark closed his eyes, and Shadow barked, once firm and sure. The room broke into soft laughter through tears. Even the judge smiled. "He knew," Diane whispered. Mark nodded. "He always knows." Across the room, Emily looked back at him, clutching the badge to her chest. He smiled, and peace settled like sunlight over the room. Mark whispered to his partner, "We did it, buddy." Shadow's tail brushed the floor twice. Outside, the storm was gone. Sunlight poured through the windows, golden, forgiving, and still. Justice, at last, looked like peace. The courthouse doors opened with a low groan, spilling sunlight across the marble floor. It was late afternoon, that golden hour when everything softened, even the edges of justice. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and new. Detective Mark Reynolds stepped out first, badge catching the light. Beside him, Shadow padded down the steps, bronze fur glinting in the sun. Behind them came Emily, her small hand in her foster mother's. She paused at the top, staring at the building that had once terrified her. Now, she didn't flinch. Reporters waited near the curb, but kept their distance. Emily let go and walked slowly toward Shadow. The dog stopped, tail swaying once before sitting still, watching her. She knelt, hands sinking into his fur. "Hi, Shadow," she whispered, voice trembling. "Thank you for finding me. Not just the shirt. Me." Mark stood a few feet away, throat tight. He crouched beside them. "You did good, kiddo." She looked up at him. "He's your best friend, isn't he?" Mark smiled faintly. "Yeah, he's my best friend." He glanced at the dog. "You're her hero, buddy." Shadow huffed softly and leaned into Emily's touch. For a moment the world stilled. Sunlight, warmth, the sound of one heartbeat against another. Emily spoke again. "Do you think he remembers?" "Remembers what?" "When he found me. When everything was dark." Mark looked at Shadow. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He remembers everything that matters." She smiled and pulled from her pocket the worn K9 training badge he'd given her. "I think it's yours." Mark shook his head. "No, that one's yours. Shadow wanted you to have it." She giggled. "He told you?" "Not with words," he said with a grin. She brushed his fur one last time. "I'll take care of it. Promise." Then she kissed Shadow's forehead, quick, shy, full of all the things she couldn't say. Mrs. Thompson called softly, "Emily, time to go." The girl stood, waved once, and turned toward the sunlight. "We'll see you soon, okay?" Mark called. She looked back and smiled. "Okay." Mark watched until she disappeared into the crowd, then let out a long breath. Shadow stood beside him, tail flicking once. "She's gonna be all right," Mark said. Shadow looked up, steady and knowing. They started down the courthouse path, shadows stretching behind them. Halfway down, Shadow paused, glancing back at the doors where Emily had walked free. His eyes held a quiet peace. Mark followed his gaze and smiled. "Sometimes justice isn't found in the courtroom," he said softly, "but in the heart of a loyal friend." Together they walked on, the courthouse closing behind them. A child saved. A man redeemed. A bond unbroken. Sometimes, stories like this remind us that love doesn't always speak in words. It's in the quiet loyalty of a dog who stands by when the world feels too heavy, in the steady eyes of a German shepherd who seems to understand before we even ask. Shadow's story isn't just about justice. It's about how animals teach us faith, forgiveness, and the kind of courage that heals. If you've ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt that unspoken bond, maybe this is your sign to lean into it a little more. Spend an extra minute playing, walking, or just sitting quietly together. And if you'd like, to learn gentle ways to understand your dog better, their needs, their emotions, their love language, there's a resource I truly recommend checking out. You'll know if it's right for you when you see it. Because at the end of the day, dogs don't just guard our homes, they guard our hearts. And that's something worth cherishing.